Sometimes we want to know the relationship between two categorical variables. So it's helpful to arrange the data in what's called a two-way table, or sometimes called a contingency table. This data is about the Titanic, the luxury liner that sank in 1912 when it hit an iceberg. Some people escaped on lifeboats and survived, but many others died. So this table gives information about one variable, whether they lived or died, which we call survival status, in relation to another variable, the travel class, or the type of accommodations they had on the boat, first class, second class, third class, or staff. The question is there an association between a person's travel class and whether or not the person survived? Another way we might ask that is, does the person's chance of survival depend on their travel class? Is survival rate explained by travel class? So because of that last sentence, we think of one variable as the explanatory variable, the variable that explains the other variable. So we're going to say the explanatory variable is their travel class, because we want to know, does what class they traveled in help to explain whether or not they survived. So the survival status is the response variable. Now we're going to calculate two types of distributions in a contingency table or a two-way table: the marginal distributions and the conditional distributions. The marginal distributions are computed using the totals column, either the totals of all the people in the travel classes or the totals of all the people in the survival classes. The conditional distributions would be the distributions within one particular value of a variable. So like the distribution of people who lived by class, or the distribution of people who died by class, or the distribution of survival within first class, second class, third class, and staff. So we're going to look at the marginal distribution of survival. When we talk about the marginal distribution of survival, that means we're looking at the totals for the survival status. How many total lived, how many total died out of the total people that were on the boat. So we're going to be looking at these numbers for our marginal distribution. Now, if I wanted to know the marginal distribution of travel class, then I would be looking at the totals in the bottom row, like what proportion of people were in first class, second class, third class, and staff out of everybody that was on the boat. But we want marginal distribution of survival. So I'm going to take 2 for lived. The proportion that lived is going to be 711 out of 2,201. And that turns out to be 0.323, or 32.3%. Okay, and you can leave it either way. I'm gonna go ahead and write that, but we don't have to. I'm just going to leave it that way though. So died would be 1490 out of 2,201, which is 0.677, or 67.7%. So notice I'm using 3 significant digits, so if you turn it into a percent, don't round it to a whole percent, leave a 1 decimal place like that. Now I want to know the conditional distribution of survival by class. In other words, I'm still looking at the distribution of survival. I'm still looking at the percent, or the proportion, or the probability of living and dying, but I'm only going to look at within each class separately, because I want to compare how likely you are to live and die within first class, second class, third class, and staff. So now I'm looking at this row, or this column, this column, this column, and this column, and these are going to be my conditional distributions. So my conditional, I'm going to have 4 conditional distributions. So I'm going to need to make a little bit more room here. So right here, I'm going to put lived and died, and I'm going to have my different classes: first class, second class, third class, and staff. So what proportion lived in first class? So I'm going to do 203 out of 325 for lived, and 122 out of 325 for died. So it turns out 0.625 lived and 0.375 died in first class. Notice we're already seeing a big difference from what we had in the total. Only 32% of the people on the boat survived, but 62.5% of people in first class survived. So that's a very large difference there that we have. Okay, so now we need to look at second class. So second class is 118 out of 285, or 0.414, about 41%, and 167 out of 285, which is about 58.6%, 0.586. Okay. Now, you understand what I'm doing now. In third class, I'd be 178 over 76 and 528 over 706. So I'm going to just tell you what those turn out to be. This is 0.252 and 0.748. Get my decimal place a little better there. 0.748. And for staff, it turns out to be 212 out of 885, 673 out of 885, or 0.240 and 0.760. So we see a very big difference between the percentage of people who lived if they were in the first class, if they were first class passengers, versus third class passengers or staff, where a very small percentage of the people survived. Second class kind of in between. So apparently there does seem to be an association between a person's travel class and whether or not the person survived, because we see very strong differences between survival rates in the different classes.